Well, hello and welcome to this second episode in the series looking at the coastline of Durham, Tyne and Wear. Today we are just a mile further south from our last location in Hartley, here at St Mary's Island, and you can see the island there just behind me. You could be forgiven for thinking that this is a miniature Lindisfarne, simply because the only access to the island is by a causeway. However, it is slightly different because one, the causeway isn't quite as long. Two, you can access this easily on foot. And three, it's not really for motor vehicles unless you're living on the island. During the 11th century, a small monastic chapel was built on the island dedicated to St Helena. St Helena was the mother of the Emperor Constantine I of Rome in 306 AD. At the age of 80, she led a crusade to Jerusalem to find the true cross of Christ. She was renowned for kindness and generosity to all. Within the chapel was a candle flame known as the Lady Light. It is unclear whether this was a warning light to sailors or a religious flame. Obviously, with the island today having a lighthouse on it, the popular idea is that this was the first beacon for shipping. The records show that the stone from the chapel was used to build the first purpose-built lighthouse and keeper's cottage around 1664. These were demolished when the present lighthouse was built. In a written account some years later, the light was recorded as St Mary's Light, and the name has remained to this day as St Mary's Island instead of St Helena's Island, as it should have been. It is thought that the chapel was actually at this end of the island where the lighthouse stands today. But back in the 1600s, the island was given a new name of Bates Island after Thomas Bates, who owned it and lived on the island. Thomas was a surveyor working for Queen Elizabeth I, and he was making charts and maps. And he came into possession of the island in 1580. So I'm guessing that on his travels surveying the land, he came across this and found it to be vacant. Another interesting fact is that in 1763, a woodcock was shot on the island and a huge diamond was found in its stomach. During the 1700s, smuggling was a common practice on the island, as it was along most of the northeast coast. If you consider at high tide, the island would have been completely cut off from the mainland, making it ideal for landing illicit cargoes. And it would have been well out of sight of the customs officials on the mainland. However, one customs official by the name of Anthony Mitchell had his suspicions that smuggling was going on the island. So he secretly laid in wait one night to catch a band of brandy smugglers. The year was 1722, and because he had acted alone, he did and was successful in surprising the gang, but on confronting them, of course, he was overwhelmed and they murdered him. That wasn't the only murder on the island, because where the causeway joins the headland is a small memorial called Curry's Point, and it's named after a Michael Curry who worked at the glassworks in Old Hartley, where we visited in the last episode. On the night of January the 11th, 1739, Michael got into an argument with a Robert Cheval, who was the proprietor of the Three Horseshoes Inn near Blythe, some 6 miles away. What the argument was about or why Robert was in Hartley that night is not clear. However, Michael slit his throat with a razor and Robert died 2 days later. According to the plaque erected on the headland, Michael was hung and then his body hung in chains and left to rot, a practice known as gibbeting. This was a common practice in dealing with murderers at this time. In 1862, a Mr. Ewan opened an inn on the island in one of the cottages. He called the inn the Freemasons' Arms, but it was more popularly known as the Square and Compass, both of those being symbols of the Masons movement. Because the island was cut off from the mainland twice a day, the inn enjoyed freedom from the normal restrictions on opening hours. It quickly became renowned for rowdy behaviour. The landowner of that period was a Lord Hastings, and in November of 1895 decided to evict Ewan after many complaints from local residents. He evicted Ewan, his family and his pig. Ewan and his family left with no resistance. However, it apparently took 6 hours to catch the pig. A month later, a John Crisp took the cottage and turned it into a temperance hotel. One of its first lodgers was the surveyor that ended up surveying the island for the building of the lighthouse in 1898. The lighthouse was long overdue, as the rocks around the island and this particular headland were particularly treacherous. 7 years earlier, in 1891, a ship called the Gothenburg ran aground in heavy fog. All 44 crew and 476 cattle were rescued safely. Well, that's all from this first location. As has become my trademark now, I'm going to leave you with the views of the island, and I will see you all at the next location in a few moments. Well, hello again, and we can now look at the iconic and very well known seaside town of Whitley Bay. The settlement here began literally as a row of cottages and known as Whitley, which means white enclosure. The name is thought to have some connection to the light-coloured magnesium limestone rocks in this area. The first records here of 1100 show that Whitley and Monkseaton, a suburb of Whitley Bay as it is today, both belonged to the manor of Graffard, situated at nearby Seg Hill. However, in 1116 they were both granted to the priory at Tynemouth by Henry I. To just briefly explain why that might have happened, we need to go back to the previous king, who was William Rufus, the son of William the Conqueror. In his reign, he had done much to suppress the influence of the Catholic Church and the monasteries. The Archbishop of Canterbury had even been banished by William Rufus. On the 2nd of August 1100, the king was out hunting in the New Forest, situated in Hampshire, accompanied by a team of huntsmen and Norman nobles, including Henry. The king was hit and killed by a stray arrow. It was widely thought that this was a deliberate accident to get rid of William. However, that is a separate story for another time. The relevance here is that England was minus its king. Henry rushed back to Winchester, where there were several arguments amongst the barons as to who had the best claim to the throne. With the backing of a few key barons, Henry seized Winchester Castle and the royal treasury. He was crowned 3 days later on the 5th of August. To help secure his position, he reinstated the deposed bishops and priors and awarded them lands in return for their support of his reign. This brings us back to our story that the prior at Tynemouth was given the lands from Seg Hill Manor, particularly for this purpose. A prior would be the appointed head of a church or priory. This could be an abbot or a deputy appointed by the abbot. The tenant farmers were duty bound to carry out certain agricultural duties for the prior. The upkeep of 2 corn mills operated by the priory, and they were also meant to entertain the prior and his household every Christmas, providing food, drink and even oats for his horses. The principal and leading family of that time took their name from the place and became known as the De Whitley family. Remember from the Northumberland series, we discussed that often families took their name from the place they lived in, or the place took the name from the principal family living there, whichever came first. It wasn't until Queen Elizabeth I's reign that surnames were introduced so that people could be identified for taxation purposes. Several members of the De Whitley family had altercations and disputes with the prior at Tynemouth over non-payment of duties and the like during the whole of the 13th century. John De Whitley inherited the lands here as a young boy in 1280. The prior at that time saw his opportunity to recoup some of his previous losses and made the boy a ward of the priory and took control of John's land. In 1290, Edward I was the King of England and headed north in one of the fights with the Scottish army. He stopped off on his journey at Norham Castle near Berwick, and John De Whitley took his opportunity to seek an audience with the king. The king found in John's favour and ordered the lands of Whitley to be returned to John. However, 7 years later, the prior got his revenge once again when William Wallace invaded England in 1297. John had hidden all his wealth, possessions, deeds and documents in a house near to Tynemouth Castle for safety. The prior, being ignorant to this, ordered the houses surrounding the castle and priory to be burned to eradicate possible hiding places for Wallace. All of John's belongings were burned and lost for all time, leaving him destitute. Descendants of John, it seems, spent the next decade stealing from others, all with good reason, of course, but by 1345 had gathered enough wealth again to be building a tower and asked the king permission to crenellate it. Those of you who have watched my castle series will remember that crenellation is the step-like fortifications added around the ramparts of a castle or fortified building for defensive purposes. It was built by Gilbert De Whitley and would have been a substantial tower as he was a military architect. He previously supervised the building of the castle in Newcastle. The site of the tower is thought to have been where the shopping arcade stands today. Maps made during the 1500s show no sign of it, so it must have been demolished before then. During the latter half of the 1300s, the De Whitley male line died out and the lands were subsequently owned by the Parker family, the Simeons, the Titlingtons, the Olivers, the Thornboroughs, the Fimers and the Ash family. So if you have any of those similar names, then you have a connection to here in Whitley Bay. After that, Whitley belonged to the Duke of Northumberland, and the principal tenants here were a family called the Dove family. Remember that name because it has great significance at our next location in the next episode. During the late 1600s, Henry Hudson, a close supporter of Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War, developed a coal mine at Whitley with a member of the Dove family. He also owned lead mines, salt pans and a limestone quarry at Whitley. During all of this time, Whitley remained a small village. But when the railways arrived in the 1860s, that all changed. A line connecting Tynemouth and Blythe meant that Whitley, with its sandy beach, was a prime site for development as a resort and a place of residence. The main developers were a Richard Nesbitt and Alfred Styan, who planned much of the town as you see it today. In 1882, North East Railways opened what was called the Coastal Loop, replacing the more inland route of the Blythe and Tyne Railway. The new station was built by William Bell and opened in the same year. By 1904, the route ran electric trains between Newcastle and Monkseaton. The station was renewed in 1910 to cope with Whitley's growing population and workers commuting into Newcastle. In 1980, the loop became part of the Tyne and Wear metro system, and the station is now a Grade 2 listed building. The original street of Whitley Village is no longer there and is now the main street in the town centre. The first 30 years of the 1900s saw housing and development expand rapidly, making a continuous built-up area joining Tynemouth, Cullercoats and Whitley Bay all the way north to St Mary's Lighthouse. In 1902, it was officially renamed as Whitley Bay. This was to avoid confusion with the similar sounding seaside town of Whitby in North Yorkshire. A wealthy owner of 2 hotels, 2 theatres and a troupe of entertainers called the Toreadors was in 1906 on the Isle of Man their version of the Greatest Showman. Not called Phineas Taylor Barnum as in the movie, but a chap called Charles Elderton. For reasons unknown, he went bankrupt and ended up coming to the northeast. He came to Hebburn initially, taking over the Theatre Royal in Carr Street. His next door neighbour was Henry Fail, the manager of the Ellison Hotel. Charles had revived the Toreador troupe of entertainers and had started performing to the Victorian tourists on the seafront here in Whitley Bay. The northeast weather being unpredictable back then, just as it is now, Charles decided to erect awnings and tents to protect his performers and the audience. Because the show was the Toreadors, these awnings were decorated in a Spanish style. This ramshackle arrangement of tents became known as the Spanish City, and that name has stuck even to this day. The performances included Jack Hastings from North Shields, whose act was to appear as half man, half woman. Other acts were dancers who danced upside down. They may have been related to the Delevils. If you don't know what I'm talking about, watch episode 1. There was a female singer called Eugenie who had a male voice. A local man, William Robson, performed as a Chinese magician, Chung Ling Su. 2 sisters did an underwater escapology act, and for a time they held the record for holding their breath underwater some 4 minutes and 18 seconds. There were ice skaters, jugglers and contortionists who made this a highly successful show. Just as P.T. Barnum got rich with his circus in America, so too did Charles Elderton with the Spanish City. On the back of that, Charles and Henry decided to add a fairground to the Spanish City, expanding the entertainment. It had a triple arched entrance and a wooden facade all around, continuing the Spanish theme. It was officially opened to the public on May the 30th, 1908, and proved to be a huge success. By the following year, in 1909, the Newcastle architects Crackit and Burns Dick were invited to design a more grand entrance, and that is pretty much the entrance that you can see today. The architects had previously designed the Laying Art Gallery and the Tyne Bridge Towers. Robert Burns Dick came up with the idea of the domed building, which still dominates the seafront here at Whitley Bay today. The dome was constructed with reinforced concrete, perfected by a French engineer called François Hennemique. Commonplace today, but revolutionary back then. Whitley was popular with the working people of Tyneside, and they dreamed of exotic surroundings for their holidays. This opulent building with its shopping malls and dancing girls would have seemed like absolute luxury to the working classes of that time. It was officially opened to the public on May the 14th, 1910. Henry Fail was the managing director and Charles Elderton was the general manager. That continued until the onset of World War I. The dome and adjoining buildings were occupied by the military, who apparently left it in a very bad state. It is at this point we lose any further mention of the entrepreneurs Charles and Henry. I'm guessing therefore that the local authority, the local council, would have taken over. But if anyone knows for certain, then please add it to the comments below this video. What I do know is that the dome was turned into a ballroom in 1920, and it became known as the Empress Ballroom. Many famous performers appeared there, as well as broadcasts done by the BBC. During World War II, the dome had to be camouflaged, as it proved to be a wayfinding landmark to enemy bombers. It was repainted grey and covered in netting. It was 1949 before the local authority could afford to repaint the dome white, but the original pure white was never achieved. By the 1960s, a company called the Pleasure Garden Company owned and managed the building and turned it into a bingo hall. During the 1970s, the locally famed Glasgow fortnight saw the town swamped with Glaswegians, all coming here to Whitley Bay for their holidays. However, a lack of investment and poor management led to the Spanish city's decline. By 1999, the building and the fairground had become unsafe. The fairground was demolished while Carlton Bingo occupied the dome at least until 2002, when the building was finally closed. After £10 million worth of investment and years of redevelopment, it finally reopened in 2018 with a modern interior catering for a new generation of holidaymakers. The Spanish city remains Whitley Bay's most outstanding feature and landmark. There have been songs written about it, the most famous of which was The Tunnel of Love, written by Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits. Whitley Bay and the Spanish city are mentioned in the song, and it apparently reflects on Knopfler's youthful memories of the Spanish city and Whitley Bay. Mark Knopfler, of course, although born in Glasgow, was brought up in Blythe, and the Spanish city and Whitley Bay was one of his favourite places to come. The modern day crime series Vera is filmed in Whitley Bay and around this region. Back in the 1970s, there was a sitcom called The Likely Lads, and that was focused on Whitley Bay and the surrounding area. The list is extensive, and when anyone talks about the Northeast, people normally think of Whitley Bay immediately. Well, that's all from here in Whitley Bay. As per usual, I'm going to leave you with some views of the town, and I will see you all in a few moments. Well, that's the end of the second episode already. If you've enjoyed it, then give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so that you will receive notifications of all the latest releases. I will see you in the next episode, which will be very soon. But for now, wishing you good health and my very best wishes, and goodbye for now.